feel like something's missing here. The next thing I want to do on the Jeep is sort out the steering, but before I really dive into that, well, that escalated quickly. A couple of things I want to do here. If you remember, I got these axle shafts used, and when I was putting them together, I noticed there's some play in the U-joints. I should have fixed it then, but I didn't have them, and I was, wanting to make progress and get the video out, so I'll do that now. There's a little C-clip in here that needs to come out. Watch your eyes here. These are both pretty well cooked. You can see some grooves from the needles on this one. That one's pretty rusty. Got some grooving on it too. So we'll get some fresh ones in. The new one's a good bit beefier too, but I think it'll fit. And since this is a closed knuckle axle, I'm going to pull these seals off. One of the things I want to do on these knuckles is a tie rod flip. Basically take the tie rod and move it from the bottom to up above the knuckle. It just gets the tie rod out of harm's way a little bit more and does help the steering geometry a little bit. Because these holes are tapered, if you just ream it from the top, you end up with sort of an hourglass shape in there and you're not bearing on the bottom of it. You can buy inserts, but I have the tools, so I'm going to make some. So before I press these in, I'm going to take my reamer, put a good wrap of tape on here. Now I've got a depth gauge for when I come in from that side. Well, Loctite is probably unnecessary on these, but a little extra insurance is never a bad thing. If you're wondering why I left this long tail on here, it's because I want to put this on my milling machine to ream the hole, but there's nothing straight or square to this hole anywhere on the knuckle. But I can drop that tail into a collet block that's squared up and centered to the spindle, and ream that hole perfectly centered and straight. Cut them off, filed them flush, and that should give probably close to about 3 inches more clearance on the tie rod. The other thing I want to do on these knuckles is to stud them. The spindles are held onto these with 3/8 fine thread bolts, and there's not a lot of meat there, so this is sort of a known weak point. The popular upgrade is to take a button head screw and screw it in from the back, but in order to do that you have to spot face around the hole so this will seat the whole way. That way you're pulling against the head of the screw rather than just the threads. I thought I could do a good enough job with just an end mill, but it turns out I don't have one that's long enough, that's the right diameter to get down in there. So I actually ordered the proper size counter bore so I can spot face this properly. And I thought about making my own pilot for it, and then I realized that that's kind of silly, so I went ahead and actually bought the right size pilot for it. Once these are in, we don't ever want them coming out, so we'll give them some of the red stuff, torque them down nice and tight. Give everything a real good cleaning, and that's what they look like all put together. And so that's what it looks like all assembled and back on the Jeep with the brakes on. Now I can start trying to figure out my tie rods. But first, Let's talk real quick about how the original steering on these Jeeps worked. The end of your steering column comes down to a steering box connected to a pitman arm. That pitman arm pushes a drag link front and back. That's connected to this bell crank, which then goes out to the wheels. So the net result is there's a lot of complexity here, a lot of extra joints. Everything develops slop. The steering box gets sloppy. All of these extra joints get sloppy, and you end up with just very vague steering. So I'm going to get rid of everything from about here down. There are certainly some guys who say these old Ross steering boxes, if they're in good shape and all of the joints are in good shape, you can get decent performance out of them. But for the most part, the people that have done the swaps on these say the swap is still better than even one of these in good shape. The worm on the end of the steering shaft is integral, so the whole steering shaft needs to drop down out of the column, which means I need to try to get the steering wheel off. I got the steering column cleaned up, got all the extra stuff stripped off it. I'm going to try to mock it up in the original position. So, obviously I need some sort of lower mount for this. I also want to cram this thing in here. This is an electric power assist steering unit. This one's out of, I think, a 2015 Hyundai. What these things do is measure the torque difference between the input and output, and if there's a difference, this motor will assist with the steering. It's a pretty good way to add power steering to a vehicle that doesn't normally have it. The Prius ones are more popular, but these are cheaper. Obviously this is metric. This is 38 millimeters. This is 1.5 inches, which if you're really good at dividing by 25.4 in your head, you've worked out that it's within a few thousandths. I should just be able to make a sleeve to join these two together. I trimmed some brackets off of the power steering that I don't need. Had to do a little clearancing on the firewall here, but I think it's in a pretty good place. This pipe is standing in for one of the high voltage cables. Obviously I'll be able to pull those back a little bit, so if it's touching it now, I think it's okay. The angle on the intermediate shaft isn't great, but I think it should be okay. Next thing is to start building a bracket. What?
Do you want to record this bit?
I've just got this tacked in for now. It already feels pretty solid, but I'll go back, fully weld everything, put in some gussets, round off some corners, make sure it's all plenty strong. Once I'm sure that everything works, nothing's binding, and I'm happy with it. So from the top of the outer tube on the power steering unit to the clamp is 9 3/4. You can see where the old webbing that was wrapped around here on that clamp is. Well, the hacksaw got through that before I even had a chance to get the camera set up. I drilled out this sleeve for more rosette welds than are really necessary. Since this is now 1/8 of an inch bigger, the original clamp from the bottom of the steering column wouldn't fit. So I split it in half. I'm just going to reshape it a little bit and then weld it in place. This thing's going to be in and out a dozen times, so there's no sense in painting it yet, but I threw some primer on it for the time being. So now what I've got to do is attach this shaft onto this. The spline on the input of this power steering unit is 19 millimeters by 16 teeth, which is not at all a standard size from what I can tell. I can't find a coupler for it anywhere, so we're going to have to do some modification. The nice thing about 19 millimeters is it's basically the same as 3/4 of an inch, and 3/4 inch is a pretty common size for steering components. So what I think I'm going to do is turn this into a double D, use this coupler. Work holding got a little weird on here because it steps down here, and I couldn't really get a collet block on here and get it in the vise because of this thing. So best thing I came up with was to use the dividing head and the footstock for support. So now I've got to join this piece to that. This is 3/4 of an inch. This is a bit over 7/8, and it's got a 5/8 hole in it. So now that goes in there, that goes in there, that goes in there. I'm gonna go put this all back together, test fit it, and it does in fact all fit together pretty well. A couple of other things to deal with before I put this back together again. Can't actually tighten those set screws, so I need to knock a little bit off this piece. I think just about the last thing I have to do is deal with the fact that this is supposed to live under the dashboard, not underneath the car, so it's not waterproof. So I'm going to go ahead and try to seal it up the best I can. In the bottom, I'm swapping out the shielded bearing for a sealed bearing. And then back in once again. So the cool thing is, now when I turn the steering wheel, that turns. The thing that's not cool is the angle of this U-joint is way too much for a single U-joint. The solution is to use a double U-joint like this one. The problem is this is I think a 21 millimeter spline, and there's really no aftermarket support for that. Obviously the stock U-joint fits it. I could possibly graft this yoke onto that U-joint, but I think it's going to be better if I machine this down to a 3/4 double D to fit this U-joint. And of course, literally as I said that, I realized that this is hollow, and that's not going to give me enough material to make a 3/4 double D on there. So apparently these don't push apart like the big ones, and in the process of trying that I wrecked the seals on it. So this thing's not usable as is, so let's go deeper down the rabbit hole and see if we come out the other side. This is the part I want of this one. Let's see if I can get this part off first. So, upon further examination, the bearing caps from these are two different sizes. The ones from the W joint are 15 millimeter outer diameter. The ones from this shaft are 16 millimeter outer diameter. But the cross pieces are all 10 millimeters, which means that I can interchange these bearings. Now I just have to figure out how to get this one out and put this one in there. Alright, I got it, and I didn't destroy anything. And the way I did this was all an experiment, and I wish I'd videoed it because it actually worked. What I did was use the little daisy plate on the arbor press, caught the two sides of the cross, and then put a socket on the top, pressed the cap up that way, and ended up having to kind of catch the corner of the cap with that piece to get it the rest of the way out, but it popped out. Looks like I need to do that other one the same way. So it turns out this cross piece is slightly longer than this one, and it doesn't fit in there. Also, this bearing is staked in instead of held in with a little screw, so I don't really want to try to take this apart. And now it fits together. Oh, I need those seals on there. Crap. Does it come apart again? And so now that fits on there, and that fits in there. For my tie rod and drag link, I got some 1-inch DOM tubing with a 3/16 wall. Gives it a 5/8 inner diameter, which is the tap diameter for an 11/16 18 tie rod end. So all I have to do is tap these. I also made my own jam nuts for these. I didn't have the right size stock, but I had some that I could machine down. There's really no reason I should be making my own jam nuts other than I can. And of course I need right-hand ones too. Got the wheels very roughly aligned so I can figure out the length of the tie rod. I think I need to take a minute to explain why I'm going to do things the way I'm doing them and some basics about different steering setups. So the piece that runs from wheel to wheel is the tie rod, and the piece that runs from the wheel to the steering box is the drag link. If you have the tie rod connected straight from wheel to wheel and your drag link connected to your tie rod, that's a T-link. You can also set it up so your double joint is on the drag link and the tie rod connects to that. That's a Y-link. Now this double tie rod end is set up for this joint to mount from the back. Since the tie rod usually goes in the back, I was thinking it would make sense to do a Y-link, have the tie rod coming off of here, and have this be my drag link. So the problem with that is I need a shock absorber, kind of like that. And so this would hit the shock absorber. So I think it makes sense to do a T-link. So I need to mount this here. Obviously this tie rod end is not the ideal geometry for this, and it might cause me other problems down the line, but we know that the Y-link isn't going to work, so let's try this, and we'll address any other problems as they rear their ugly head. So just like on the knuckles, I made a tapered insert, and I'm going to ream it from the other side. I also want to spot face the backside of this so the nut has a flat spot to land. The classic steering swap on these Jeeps is to use a Saginaw box that sits out in front of the front cross member. I don't really like that look because it's kind of hanging out in front of the grill. I'm going to use this reverse rotation Ford Ranger steering box. It's going to sit behind the cross member, behind the grill, look a little bit more stock. Sometimes I get tired of making things out of metal, so for mounting this I just hot glued some pieces of 1/4-inch plywood together. This Jeep's pretty light, so I think that should be good enough. Now it's just a question of figuring out where to put this so nothing hits anything else. So, I've been staring at this for way too long now, and I've come to the conclusion that I have major clearance issues. Not too bad there. I have clearance issues between the tie rod and my pitman arm. And I've tried moving things around to get them to a point where things will clear. Alright. So I thought about this some more, did a little bit more reading, and there's really no reason I can't put the drag link behind my tie rod. So just for mock-up, I grabbed the original tie rod end for the Jeep, and I think this might work. I think in order to make this work, I'm going to need a shorter pitman arm to be able to shift the drag link back a little bit more. I did move the steering box back some, but I'm really only using about half the travel of this steering box right now anyway, so I think I can get away with it. But rather than keep buying parts and throwing them at it, let's make a test piece. Checking lock-to-lock travel on the drag link end, it's going to be about 5 3/8. That steering box goes about 97 degrees. We'll call it 90 just to make the math easier. So if this is our steering box, we care about our pitman arm when it's all the way right and all the way left. And we know this is 5 3/8. We know this is 90, so we just need to solve for these legs. We could have a pitman arm as short as 3.8 inches and get full travel. I don't think they make one that short. That seems to have solved my pitman arm issues, and since the pitman arm is tracing a smaller radius arc than the steering knuckles, the tie rod and drag link are actually moving apart as the wheels turn. I did hit another issue though, which was that the drag link was going to hit this shock that has magically appeared in this video. So I swapped this back to a Y-link, so this is now my drag link, and this is my tie rod, and just bumping that forward means that everything's clearing a lot better now. Well, I do appreciate the hardwood pitman arm. I think I should order a steel one. That'll be here like... I spent way too much time trying to think about how to build a mount plate for this. Ultimately, I came to the realization that I should just do it the way it would be done if it were a factory mount. They would have just drilled holes through the frame, reinforced them, and bolted the thing on. So that's what I'm going to do. So I can drill a hole through here, put this thing in. This end will butt up against the outside frame rail. Don't really even need to weld that in, I don't think. And then weld in around here. That way when I bolt it in, it won't collapse the frame rail. Of course I have a bolt that needs to live up here, and there's not a piece of frame up here, so let's build one. So I definitely bozoed that one and misread my step drill. Drilled it out to 11/16 instead of 9/16, but I just made a bushing that's 11/16 instead. Now I can use that as a drill guide to make sure I go through the frame rail straight. I think before I weld that in place and do the last hole, I want to hook all of this up and make sure nothing's binding. There's not a huge amount of room in here for a collapsible shaft, but something's better than nothing. Actually, before I hook this up, this power steering unit has a self-centering feature on it, so I want to put some power to it and get it centered, make sure everything is lined up as best we can before we hook this up. I've got 12 volts running in here, and then I just need 12 volts on the enable pin on here. And I'll probably do some weird things because I've been playing around with it. Okay, so that should be centered then. Now I need to make up a bracket for that support bearing so this double U-joint doesn't do that. If you're thinking the support bearing is too far from that double U-joint, you're right, which also means that that collapsible shaft isn't going to work. So this thing fits real nice on the end here, but I do have a good bit of taper in here. I really only care about the diameter where the U-joint attaches and where this is going to sit back here. So I can undercut this middle part a little bit. While I've got this set up in the collet block, I might as well drill the pockets for the set screws. I made another bracket for the support bearing, picked up this hole in the frame at the bottom. Obviously I'm losing the collapsible shaft, but reality check, this is going to be one of the less unsafe parts of this vehicle. I don't think having 2 inches of this shaft collapse is really going to do a whole lot in an accident in this thing. And being able to move the support bearing makes all of this a lot more solid. I'm not feeling anything binding up here. I've got the drag link hooked back to the pitman arm. So now when I turn the steering wheel, the wheels turn. Of course, I should also check and make sure that everything still moves freely when the suspension is loaded and flexed. Well, that's about 500 pounds of salvaged industrial robot batteries, 165 pounds of lead, and one very large gear. Yep. As the suspension compresses and the leaf springs flatten out, the axle actually moves back a little bit, which moves the tie rod back, which means that now the tie rod is hitting on the pitman arm there, which means that I either need to move the steering box back or up or both. So I made up another set of brackets, got those tacked in, and then realized I was really close to being able to use this original hole from the frame. It's reinforced, it's there, and actually if I mounted it to this plate it would have put this hole somewhere that probably would have interfered with that. If there's an original hole there, I might as well try to use it. It's actually going to tuck that pitman arm up super close to the frame there, which is really good. It's actually close enough that I had to cut out the original bell crank bracket from the bottom of the frame. That was pretty miserable. I did manage to get it done, but it was getting late and I was really frustrated with it, so I left all this mess for this morning. I'm going to get this cleaned up and then see if these puzzle pieces fit together this way. Looking pretty good right up until full lock. The drag link is just barely hitting this shock. I ended up moving the steering box forward, which means I can't use this hole as a direct mount. But in the time that I spent staring at this, I came up with another idea. I need to order a 7/16 machine tap. I'm still getting the drag link touching the shock, but it's very much an edge case. It only does it at full lock when the suspension is fully flexed this way and compressed on this side. I could potentially go to a smaller diameter shock, more like the originals, or maybe find a different tie rod end here. But I think just looking at it, it doesn't really seem like it's binding up, so I think I'm just going to leave it for now and hopefully it's not a problem. Okay, turn that way, passenger. I only gusseted one side of this because I need to be able to get a wrench in to tighten that. Spent a while adjusting this. It's at a point where nothing's binding on it. I was able to pick up this bottom frame hole, so I'm going to use a bolt there and then weld the top and plug weld the side. Everything still moves. Obviously this cable needs some managing. I think it's supposed to clip onto the fender, so I'll see once I have the fender on where that lies. And now I just want to pull all of this apart and finish welding this stuff and clean it up. You know, I had a few people tell me I should put those bolts in the other way, so if the nuts come off, the bolts don't fall out. I guess maybe there's something to that. I was a little worried about that. I plated across the top of this and then cleaned up the welds as best I could, try to make it look a little less out of place. I feel like I'm supposed to slap this and say that's not going to go anywhere, but hopefully that's ready to go everywhere. For the full effect, I put the grill back on. I'm really happy with how this looks. It's nice and clean in the front. It doesn't totally look stock, but it certainly doesn't ruin the appearance either. I did have to cut some clearance in the grill, and I might have to do the same with the fender here a little bit, but that's not really a big deal. This power steering unit didn't like trying to run off of my little power supply and test leads, so I pirated the battery out of my four-wheeler, hooked it up directly to that. At some point I'll put this control unit on the inside of the firewall. I'll need to lengthen all of the wires to it, but I'm not mentally, physically, or spiritually ready to start wiring this thing yet. I'm also not totally thrilled with this double U-joint. It's pretty low quality. I might swap it out for a better one at some point, but for right now it's good enough. Obviously a good bit more tweaking and adjusting that needs to be done on this, but I'm at the point where I need to move on to other parts of this project, but it sure feels good to have this steering, and the steering feels pretty good. Obviously I don't have any weight in the front yet, but it feels pretty light. I think next up is going to be to get the brakes working. That can't be that hard, right? If you want to see that, stick around, and thanks for watching.